Welcome everybody to my little presentation, moving away from the monoplot, teaching unconventional narrative structures. What is the monoplot? Why should we move away from it? What unconventional narrative structures have you been teaching, Chris? I will try to answer these questions and try to be interesting while doing it. And hopefully all will become clear. And I'm going to start with a hook in true screenwriter fashion. My hook is going to be talking you through the plot of No Country for Old Men, the Coen Brothers film from 2008, and telling you a little bit about why this is a significant film to me and why it sort of was the starting point for my PhD project and the kind of research that I've been developing and the way of teaching screenwriting that I've been developing too for the last couple of years. So, No Country for Old Men begins with some panoramic shots of Texan scenery and a sort of laconic voiceover, world-weary voiceover from a character who we don't know the identity of yet, talking about I think he's talking about sort of life and death and policing and morality and evil, the nature of evil and policing, something along those lines, if I'm remembering rightly. Very typical Coen Brothers opening, a voiceover delivering theme, which they use in many of their films. And then the first character that we really meet is the antagonist, Sugar, played by Javier Bardem, very enigmatic and engaging, brutal, evil antagonist. We see him killing a police officer, pictured on screen there, and then escaping from police custody and then killing an innocent civilian in a very creative way as well, like cattle prod. And then we meet the hero, the protagonist, Llewellyn, played by Josh Brolin. And he's a very traditional protagonist, traditional hero, kind of a good old boy, masculine, sort of closed-mouthed, capable. He's a hunter, so he's a good shot. And we see him stumble across the aftermath of a drug deal gone wrong, and he finds a bunch of dead bodies and a case of cash. And he makes a foolish Aristotelian mistake of judgment, tragic error of judgment, and he decides to take the cash. And there's a guy who is dying, who's asking him for water. He's kind of in this car, bloody and close to death, saying agua, agua. And Llewellyn sort of isn't impressed, and he says, like, I ain't got no water. I won't do the accent again. But he doesn't have water, doesn't give him the water, takes the money and leaves, goes back home, stashes the money, doesn't tell his wife. And then in the middle of the night, he's got a guilty conscience. And he wakes up and he prepares a big jug of water, and he goes back to deliver water to the guy who was dying. So we see that he is a good person and he has a conscience. And when he gets there, people who have a stake in the deal gone wrong arrive. They chase him. He's almost killed, but he manages to escape. His truck is left behind. So now the killer, Sugar, is put on his trail and is going to track him down and get the money back. So it's a very traditional opening, very traditional antagonist, traditional protagonist. And we then meet the Tommy Lee Jones character, Ed Tom Bell, who is a local sheriff who checks out the scene, finds the truck, recognizes it as Llewellyn's, knows him, and as the film plays out, he's on Llewellyn's tail. Oh my, there we go. He's on Llewellyn's tail for the second act of the film. And the second act of the film, again, is very traditional. We've got our heroic, engaging protagonist who is on the run with this money, and this brutal, amoral killer trying to track him down. And the Tommy Lee Jones character is very much on the fringe. I think it's probably the way that I understand the dramatic orchestration of the script. I would call him an ally to the protagonist. You could view him as a protagonist of a subplot, but it's really, I think it's the same plot. It's the pursuit of Llewellyn. So I think he's a fringe ally to the protagonist. And it's this very effective, powerful, traditional narrative continues up until the third act, when something very, very unusual happens. About 10 minutes into the third act, which is about a 30-minute third act, Llewellyn has decided that he's going to stop running from Sugar and he's going to face him. So he's stopped running and he's now like turned around and he's planning to track Sugar down and go and kill him. But as he's going into his motel room, kind of close to the end of the first sequence of the third act, about 10 minutes in, he meets this flirtatious woman by the pool, and she starts flirting with him and offers him a beer, and he quite likes it, but he says he's married, and he's kind of rebuffing her, but maybe she's talking him round. And we get a really incongruous fade to black. It's a notably odd, slightly slow fade to black, and there really hasn't been a climax for this sequence. It's clearly not the end of a unit of drama in the traditionally recognizable sense. When we cut back in, we're with the Ed Tom Bell character in his car, very much in his perspective, and he sees from a distance the aftermath of a shootout and a truck speeding away with kind of rifles firing. And he goes to investigate, and it's this motel, Llewellyn's motel, where this incident is happening. He goes in and he discovers Llewellyn dead, killed off screen about 10 minutes into the third act, with about 20 minutes left of screen time, and really dispatched in a very by the way fashion. You know, there is no build up and sudden kind of sense that this guy's going to die. It's very sudden. He's just discarded with off screen, and not by Sugar, the main antagonist, by fringe antagonists who are the Mexican cartel, who are also involved in the drug deal. So the protagonist is dead suddenly, 20 minutes before the end of the film. And like in Psycho, when Marion Crane is killed at the midpoint, and you get a succession of replacement protagonists taking the role of protagonist, Ed Tom Bell replaces Llewellyn as the protagonist. He's by far the most prominent character for the remainder of the third act. And he doesn't really do much. He's not very active. He doesn't really pursue Sugar. There's a scene where he almost chances upon Sugar, but he's not really pursuing him. He's not really trying to track him down. And the third act, really, in this pictorial way of representing the plot that I bashed together on PowerPoint, really looks a bit more like this, because Llewellyn dies with a big chunk left, and we get these lengthy scenes of Ed Tom Bell talking about life and death and evil with a colleague, visiting another colleague, and talking about the absence of God significantly in a way that I think points to the main theme of the film. He says something like, I always thought when I got older, God would come into my life, but he didn't. And there's a scene with Llewellyn's wife where she's probably killed by Sugar, the bad guy. It happens off screen, but it's implied that she's killed. Then he's hit by a car and injured and has to kind of escape. And we don't really know what's going to become of him. And then the last scene is Ed Tom Bell, again, talking with his wife in a very Cormac McCarthyan manner, describing a dream that he has of his father, him and his father riding horses in the night, and his father riding off ahead into the darkness and being alone in this expansive darkness, eternity of darkness. But he knows that somewhere up ahead, his dad is making a fire and that it's going to be okay when he's back with his dad. Very McCarthyan kind of theme to be dealing with, this idea of a universe of emptiness, just dark death and nothingness and emptiness, with a little point of love at the center, a little point of light and heat and love. The Road is very much on it, about a similar kind of view of the world. So when I was studying for my master's degree, this film was out, and that third act just hit me like a sledgehammer. It woke me up. I was just, as soon as this radical thing happened, I was just like, what? It was shocking and striking. And I wanted to understand it, understand what that effect was. Why did it have such a big impact on me? What was so unusual about it? And I didn't really get an answer. I remember we talked about it in our class, and no one, including me, could really define what was so odd about it. And I couldn't find any writing that talked about it. And any writing in screenwriting handbooks that I found very unhelpful. Here is some of the things which I find unhelpful. I'll just try and move the. I'll cover up part of it at a time. Here are some of the quotes from screenwriting handbooks that I find unhelpful and that really put me off, annoyed me about screenwriting handbooks, because it just seemed, frankly, not accurate and not true. David Mamet, obviously incredibly credible dramatist, but I think his writing about the screenplay is not very helpful at all. That which the hero requires is the play. In the perfect play, we find nothing extraneous to his or her single desire. Every incident either impedes or aids the hero/heroine in the quest for the single goal. I think this is very, very true for a conventional single protagonist drama. But what about the many, many, many models with more than one protagonist, which Linda Aronson very convincingly outlines? Robert McKee is very keen on change, talks a lot about change being the absolute core of drama, both at the level of scene and at the level of macro structure. And again, I agree that is a really useful tool in the dramatist's toolkit and can be very effective. But the way that it's discussed is just misleading. And Paul Schrader wrote in the introduction to Faber collection of his screenplays, writing about Taxi Driver, he said that Travis Bickle, at the end of Taxi Driver, Travis Bickle hasn't changed, but he's been revealed. And if Paul Schrader says about one of the most canonical films in American cinema that the character doesn't change, and then you've got Robert McKee saying you have to change, and then something's up there. And it always irked me. 3 acts are the minimum, he says, too. Very declarative. You must have 3 acts, he says. Not true. You can have fewer. It's just the convention. to have 3 acts. He says that you can't have less than 3 acts in a feature-length form. I disagree, as we will come on to. Syd Field too. Yeah, Syd Field and John Yorke and Chris Vogler. But Chris Vogler, I think, has lots of really helpful stuff and useful stuff in the hero's journey. I think Into the Woods has quite a lot of helpful stuff too. But they have this tendency to declare that their model accounts for all storytelling, all stories ever told. All storytelling, conscious or not, follows the ancient patterns of myth. John Yorke says one either tells all stories according to a pattern, his pattern that he's selling, or not at all, to which I say nonsense. He said every good script he read shared the same underlying structural traits. He says many places, I think he says that writers have no choice but to use the model that he proposes. And he said it underpins all storytelling. And he says underplayed endings feel wrong, which I would say No Country for Old Men doesn't feel wrong to me. It feels incredibly powerful. So this idea of wanting to understand the unconventional choices in powerful films like No Country for Old Men, and wanting to challenge and talk back to frankly the misinformation in the most popular screenwriting handbooks was really the kind of starting point for my PhD project and for my research in general. And finding the work of Paul Galino of this parish, whose feet I have worshipped at the last conference, and Linda Aronson was really transformative, because their work, I think, feels very honest and helpful. The more populist handbooks, I feel like they're using me. They're using me to enrich the author. And they don't care what they say that much. That's how it feels when I read them. I don't get that from Linda and from Paul. So there's some useful quotes from Linda's book on the screen. And I like to be given a moment to read text that's on the screen. So I'll give you a moment to read those quotes. I found it very refreshing to see the way Linda talks about conventional narrative structure. Here's the convention. It's very useful, but it's the convention. And there are many alternatives. And she's very strong on identifying multiple protagonist alternatives. And I think she's absolutely right that the more you know about structure, the more you can control and focus audience emotions, and the more you can discuss your subject matter and frame the world in a way that is in accordance with your viewpoint and your ideology, rather than trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You know, like, for example, trying to write a script about community and group interaction with a single protagonist. Well, there are films that do that, but it might not be the best tool for the job. So this led to the main research question that sort of guides certainly the research that I do and some of the practice that I do, which is this: what is narrative structure, and what meanings does it create for the viewer? That's primarily what I'm interested in, and very much from a practice orientation. Really, I'm only interested in what helps me to write a good screenplay and how I can hopefully provide some help for the young Chris and people like him. And it sort of takes two forms: clearly defining what this conventional narrative structure is and the meaning that it creates. There's lots of great work out there on that, but I've tried to add to it. And more importantly, finding and defining what the unconventional alternatives are and the meanings that they create. And there is some work out there on the unconventional alternatives, but there's an awful lot I found which there's little or no work on, certainly from a practice orientation. So I'll do a little bit more, five minutes more maybe, on this part of my research, my attempt to contribute to the clear definition of what conventional narrative structure is, and importantly, what meaning it creates. So this is the model that I developed and that I have called conventional monoplot. And it's in no way unusual or unfamiliar or radical. It's very much what that quote I just showed from Linda Aronson was talking about. And it's very similar to what Paul Gallino presents in the sequence approach, very much based on what Paul has done, with a couple of sort of minor amendments that represent just a very slightly different viewpoint on some of the things that Paul notices. I think the idea of the feature film typically being broken down into 8 sequences, I think is very convincing. I think Paul makes a strong case for that. And this model highlights the overlaps in the most dominant handbooks and the way that seems to be enacted within industry, in my personal experience, and within the very large body of a few hundred films that I studied to try and see how does this work in practice. As I said, very, very similar to what Paul presents in the sequence approach. Slight differences. I describe the midpoint as the point of dawning realization, because it seems to me in an awful lot of the films that I looked at, the midpoint, a useful way to think about the midpoint is as the point in which the protagonist or the viewer or both starts to become aware in some way of what the central problem is, what the protagonist will have to do to overcome the central problem, what the dramatic climax is going to look like. It's like we start to kind of become aware of what the climax is going to be in some way. That seems like a useful way to think about it to me. And the first part of the third act as well, in an awful lot of the films that I looked at that embody this conventional model, I think the first part of the third act can be effectively understood as movement towards confrontation. So in some way, it's the protagonist preparing themselves for the confrontation of the dramatic climax. Preparing emotionally, psychologically, getting literal equipment in a kind of, war fantasy-based Lord of the Rings type narrative. So the way that I propose using a model like this, and the reason that I've termed it conventional monoplot, is to focus on its ubiquity and its homogeneity, as well as its usefulness. To say that this is primarily the main job you'll get hired to do, to our students, is to enact this. And it can be really effective, but it's become incredibly dominant and has contributed to a homogenization of film culture. And perhaps it underpins the dominant ideology, and perhaps it isn't well suited to dissent. And maybe its dominance within contemporary film culture fringes dissent, fringes the non-normative, pushes the non-normative narrative to the cultural fringe. I've got a few slides on work that I think is useful, that I like to present to students when I'm teaching this model, to talk about the associations of this model and the criticisms of this model, to make them aware of its implications. In order to make sure I don't run over time, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the slides on screen and let you read the selected quotes that I've pulled out. Maybe you'll be, very familiar with them already, but I'll just put these quotes up on screen. There's about 5 slides, and I won't add to them, but maybe we can talk about them in the Q&A afterwards if that's interesting. So I'll just put these up on screen, and I'll give you a minute or two with each slide and let you read. Okay. It's actually mostly me, that slide. Some paraphrasing and a bit of an addition from me, I realized. The rest are mostly quotes. So here's another slide from quoting Linda Aronson and David Foster Wallace. This is from Dan Hassler Forrest, his book Capitalist Superheroes. Ann Cooper, I can't remember. Ann Cooper, I think. I think I have 2 more slides for you. 3 more. 3 more. This one's on Jeff Meny and his book, which I believe is called Post-Fordist Cinema, which I recommend. got a second slide from Jeff, or reflecting on Jeff's stuff. And one more with tons of quotes. So this is from Jess King's book, Inclusive Screenwriting from 2022, which I only found recently and I think has a lot of really useful stuff in it. Here's a selection of stuff I think is really useful. And this is the last of these slides. So I'll give you a couple of minutes with that. Yeah, I highly recommend that one. Lots of very useful stuff in it for my students. So that was a little look. I was muted for a moment. Yeah, that was a little look at the way that I try to define what this conventional structure is and what does it do? What does it do to the viewer? What do we do to people when we repeat this story, and what's done to us when we repeatedly encounter almost nothing but this story, certainly in mainstream cinema. So yeah, let's move on to the more fun bit, which is the finding the alternatives and quantifying them and quantifying the meanings that they create for the viewer. What can that do for the screenwriter? How can they, what useful tools are there out there that the corporate neoliberal screenwriting handbooks, which I will call them, have ignored and delegitimized? Why isn't there great knowledge on these unconventional models? What are they? So these are the unconventional models as defined against that monoplot model. These are the models that I found which divert significantly from the monoplot. So they're unconventional as measured against the monoplot. And that's key because the multiple protagonists narrative is not uncommon at all. It just defies what an awful lot of screenwriting handbooks say and have increasingly solidified as a norm, which is that the single protagonist is the ideal form for the screenplay. Of course, it isn't. It's just a choice, and it has a particular meaning. So I've identified the elongated first act model, which I think is the least interesting of the models. It's basically where the inciting incident comes very, very late. And there are a few films where this happens and where this creates a particular effect. Bob Le Flambeur by Jean-Pierre Melville is an interesting example of this. The inciting incident doesn't really happen until right at the end of the first act, about 30 minutes in. And that creates space for basically a sort of cinematic version of place writing, reflection of tone and mood and place. And there are a few other examples of a similar kind of approach. The zero protagonist model, which is something that I propose as a way of reading a few interesting films which include L'Argent by Robert Bresson and Hunger by Steve McQueen. I argued that Hunger really doesn't have any character that is a recognizable protagonist, that does what a protagonist tends to do. The most prominent character in that film, the Bobby Sands character, played by Michael Fassbender, seems a lot more to me like what Linda Aronson calls a mentor antagonist. Very interesting character who arrived to provoke change in other characters and who we don't meet for quite a long time, till the end of the first act. The one-act narrative, which there is a bit of writing about. Robert McKee wrote an article on his website about one-act narratives. Danziger and Rush have written a bit about one-act narratives, but I haven't found much. So if anyone knows of good writing on one-act narratives, please recommend it. The two-act narrative, I have found almost nothing about two-act narratives. Danziger and Rush have got about 2 paragraphs on the two-act narrative. And the only film that they can propose as a two-act narrative is She's Gotta Have It by Spike Lee, which I actually don't think is a two-act narrative. And I think there are some others out there, which I'm going to look at. The siege narrative, Linda Aronson proposes the idea of a siege narrative as a group of protagonists fending off a very active and aggressive antagonist. And I've tried to sort of add and build onto that theory. And I think it's a really strong one. I think it's a really good way to define films like The Power of the Dog, for example, in which the Benedict Cumberbatch character, clearly the most prominent, the most interesting character, the one we discover the most about psychologically and emotionally. But I really don't think that he can be understood as a protagonist. I think he's an antagonist. And I think he's aggressively attacking a protagonist family group. And I think there are a few other films that also can be best understood with that model. And there are various passive protagonist structures, which again, there's some good writing about, but not much that I've been able to find, certainly from a practice orientation. Multiple protagonists, there's a wide array of multiple protagonist options, which Linda Aronson writes about very convincingly. Modular narratives and the puzzle plot, there's loads of great critical writing from Warren Buckland and Alan Cameron and Thomas Elsasser and Serica Nieline, who is my former colleague as well. Lots of good writing on this, not much from a practice orientation, mostly from a more like a film studies orientation. And the untimely death of the protagonist, that's mine, that's my suggestion. I've copyrighted it, I haven't, but that's how I propose to understand the model in No Country for Old Men, in Psycho, in which the protagonist is killed before the dramatic climax, a significant length of time before the dramatic climax. And I think that has a marked effect on the meaning that the narrative produces. There are a few other examples of this type of film. Fruitvale Station, which is Ryan Coogler, I think his first film, which was I think it was a Sundance Award winner. I think the protagonist in that dies before the end in a race. I think it's a racist cop killing, and his family are left to deal with the aftermath of it for the kind of the dramatic climax portion of the narrative. There's a William Friedkin film called To Live and Die in LA from the 80s, in which, again, the protagonist is killed very shockingly before the dramatic climax. And the Derek Cianfrance film, The Place Beyond the Pines, also protagonist, Ryan Gosling character is killed after about 50 minutes. The Bradley Cooper character who kills him takes over as protagonist. Very radical. So I will, as I suspected I would, I've gone for longer than I meant on the portion leading up to here, but I've picked out 4 of these alternative models to go into a little bit more depth on. So I'll do that, and then I'll shut up and see if anyone's got any questions. So the first one I thought we could look at is one example of a multiple protagonist narrative, the consecutive stories narrative, which Linda Aronson details very at length in her book, and I've kind of added a little bit in my work to the attempt to understand this type of narrative. Here is what Linda Aronson says about this type of film. I'll let you read rather than reading to you. So essentially, a sequence of short stories, one after the other, can take a variety of different forms, can take the Rashomon form, in which basically the same event is replayed from different perspectives, can take the Place Beyond the Pines form, which is very sequential. One protagonist, then another, little overlap between the stories. Can take the Pulp Fiction model, which is a bit more non-linear and plays with chronology and time structure. What meaning does this type of narrative create? Why use it? Why should the screenwriter use a model like this? Excuse me. So Linda Aronson says, if you want to write about several possible outcomes triggered by one event, this is the structure to use. Thurza Wakefield said of The Place Beyond the Pines that it's a transgenerational narrative without a dominant character, which I think is true, in which life moves around the characters as they remain unalterably themselves and getting nowhere. So very much challenging what Robert McKee says about the primacy of change. Robich argues that the film operates with a quite different understanding of time, cyclical rather than linear, helping to complete the sketch of a world in which events repeat themselves at certain intervals. The idea of being transgenerational and cyclical. And there's an emphasis on fate and cyclical thinking that makes The Place Beyond the Pines very atypical viewing for mainstream Western audiences, which I agree with. I think it's a superb film. So this is saying very different things about the world than the linear, single protagonist, willful pursuit of a goal. A Touch of Sin by Jia Zhangke, a Chinese filmmaker, is a brilliant and fascinating example of this model, I think. So we're going to look at that a little bit because I think it's interesting to look at. I'll just let you read the quotes that I provided about the film. Oh, wait. Trying to get this out of the way. Yeah. So this is a model that's allowing Jia Zhangke to create a kind of state of the nation. And again, there's this idea of circularity, and there's the idea of dissent. He's able to critique the rapacity of Chinese capitalism in a way that, let's say that, in a way that wouldn't be possible with the single protagonist model. You could still critique those things, but in a different way, and perhaps less effectively. If you break down the narrative structure of this film, it's beautifully, harmoniously balanced, I put it to you. And it won Best Screenplay at Cannes in 2013. It's comprised of 4 main stories, standalone stories. And those 4 stories in combination are almost exactly 2 hours long. The first one, 36, the second, 24, and then 30 and 30. Beautifully, harmoniously weighted. And those little stars and boxes above are meant to represent the monoplot, the 3-act structure being shrunk into each story, as is typical. They each have their own 3-part monoplot. And if you look at the hook and coda. There's a 4-minute hook, the protagonist of which is this Zhao San character. Dahai also appears in the hook, and then Dahai takes over as protagonist for the first story. And then Zhao San re-emerges as protagonist for the second story. So there's a really nice poetic harmony to the way Jia Zhangke has built this narrative, combating the fragmentation of segmenting the narrative up, like a poet, you know, designing structure at the level of the sentence. It's almost like enjambment, at the enjambment, at the level of narrative structure. And then Zhao Yu, the protagonist of story 3, is the protagonist of the coda. Again, there's this beautiful, harmonious structure once you dig into it, both in terms of the duration of the different parts, the harmony between where the protagonists are placed. Well worth delving into. So that's one of the multiple protagonist models and the kind of different meanings it offers to the screenwriter. The one-act narrative, I think, is well worth looking at and teaching to students. There are a lot of them around the last few years. Here are some quotes from McKee and Danziger and Rush. And again, I'll just let you read the quotes and then I'll talk to you about the model a bit. So those last 2 points are maybe the most important to bear in mind for the one-act model. This idea of a flattened structure with no turning points, in which pressure gradually accumulates without the reversals of a turning point. And the conflict is already in motion before the narrative begins. The inciting incident has happened in the backstory. And there are a lot of these films in recent years, and they've been quite prominent. You know, I argue this is not the only way to understand Uncle Boonmee, but I argue that Uncle Boonmee can be effectively understood as a one-act narrative with a few unusual aspects of it. A Palme d'Or winning film. Nomadland, I think, is very best understood as a one-act film. Best Picture winner. Lady Bird, I think you can say that Lady Bird kickstarted Greta Gerwig's career, and the fact that it has this personality, unconventional personality to it, at the level of structure, I think is a key part to how she was able to develop a distinctive voice that led to Margot Robbie saying, get her to make Barbie. And there you go, look at what she did with Barbie. If we try to present it visually, it might look something like this. Single protagonist, all act 2, perhaps. Maybe not the only way to understand the model, but some people propose it, and I think it has some validity. Inciting incident in the backstory before the narrative begins. There probably will be an incident at the typical point, but it won't be an inciting incident. It won't be provoking change, pushing the life in a new direction. There may well be a midpoint, but maybe a bit less dramatic. And there will be a dramatic climax, but again, maybe a bit less definitive and suggesting more external stasis and internal change, perhaps. Here is Lady Bird, my attempt to show Lady Bird's structure pictorially. So the very first image in Lady Bird is that image there, of Lady Bird and her mum asleep, face to face. It's an image it's both intimate and they're at each other's heads. They're in conflict, which is very much how the film plays out. They love each other truly, they care for each other, but they're at each other's throats. And the inciting incident is in the deep past. It's Lady Bird being born to an emotionally damaged mother. As the narrative progresses, it's very episodic. There are episodic antagonists, a love interest, another love interest, a popular girlfriend. But it always returns to this main conflict with the mum. And the third movement, let's say, rather than third act, the closing movement of the film, they argue. Lady Bird goes off to college. Mum refuses to say goodbye to her. And the final sequence is Lady Bird away at college. She hasn't made up with her mum, but she narrates a very loving and understanding letter to her mum. So they don't make up, but we see her mum regret being so cold, and we see Lady Bird sort of forgiving her mum. So there's a sense of reconciliation, but no actual reconciliation. It's a tragic ending, but with a sense that Lady Bird is okay with it, that she's accepted her mum's behavior on some level, which is quite poor throughout the film. I think I may just have time to do a 2-act model as well, and then I'll probably run out of time. So I'll quickly look at an example of the 2-act structure. So like I say, I have found very, very little work on 2-act narrative structure, and very few films that I think are 2 acts. So if anyone can suggest any readings and any films, I'd be very grateful. I think it's a really, really powerful model. The films that I found that I think are best understood as 2 acts are very powerful films, but they're very rare. So here is a suggestion of some films that I think are best understood as 2 acts. I'll let you read the text. So there's very little work that I've been able to find about this type of film, but this idea of flouting expectations at the film's end, I think, is very relevant. I think Full Metal Jacket is a 2-act film, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. A short film about killing, I think, is very clearly 2 acts, 2 very equal acts. If anyone's seen the film, the first act concerns the character pictured choosing to murder somebody and then murdering them, and it climaxes with an 11-minute very realist and real-time murder. And the second act of the film is about the state sentencing him to death and the state killing him. And the climax of the second part of the film structurally mirrors the first. It's an 11-minute, I think it's 11, it might be 12. In my memory, it's 11-minute long, again, very realistic, real-time depiction of him being executed by the state. And it's very clear 2-act structure. There's no third act, and the structure functions to compare the 2 killings and say to the viewer, here you go, look at these 2 killings and think about it. In Fabric, the Peter Strickland film, I think is a 2-act film. I don't like it very much, so I haven't studied it at great depth, but I do believe it's a 2-act film. The Souvenir, the Joanna Hogg films, Souvenir and Souvenir Part 2, I think they're 2 1-act films, and that they combine into a long 2-act film released in 2 parts. I think that's the most convincing way that I have found to understand the narrative structure of that project. And, what a significant project that is. So these, Full Metal Jacket, a short film about killing, to me, are two of the most powerful films of the 20th century, certainly that deal with violence. And The Souvenir, one of the most significant projects of 21st century British cinema. So this, even though it's very rare, I think this is a significant model. She's Got to Have It, I don't agree, is 2-act, but Don't Scream Rush say that it is. So I think to finish off, I was going to look at puzzle plot films as well, but I have overtalked. So to finish off, I'll just kind of quickly go through why I think Full Metal Jacket is a 2-act film and what meaning that creates. I imagine people are familiar with Full Metal Jacket. The first act is all about boot camp. Joker and a group of others entering boot camp, this brutal, dehumanizing boot camp. I think Joker is the protagonist of this act, but he's quite inactive for a lot of it. By far, the most active character is the Lee Ermey, drill sergeant character. By far the most active, but clearly an antagonist. And Gomer Pyle is bullied because he's so inept. And Joker tries to help him, but eventually joins in the bullying. And then it climaxes with Pyle murdering the drill sergeant in front of Joker, kind of implying him as culpable, partly culpable. But then it ends, and then we're into Vietnam. And I think I'm right in saying Pyle is never even mentioned again. I think that's right. And in the second act, second movement of the film, I think it's right to call it the second act. It's longer than the first. It's about 73 minutes. And in this act, Joker is part of a media division in Vietnam. He's sent out on a mission with a group of soldiers. And I think it's convincing to look at this second act as a multiple protagonist act. You could look at it that way. Eventually, there's a lot of conflict within the group, and part of their mission is enacted. And then they're pinned down by a sniper in a very long, drawn-out midpoint ordeal, I will argue, with several of the characters killed, and they have to battle their way into the belly of the beast. This is a traditional midpoint, a hero's journey midpoint, into the belly of the beast, the darkest part of the journey, to come face to face with, evil. Although in this example, the evil is a 12-year-old girl. They find the sniper is a 12-year-old girl. I think Joker kills her. I didn't go back and check, but I'm pretty sure Joker is the one that kills her. And I really think that this structure is a very traditional monoplot structure, but with a long first act and a long second act that's cut short. I think this is about 3/5 of a traditional narrative. And after the sniper is killed, we get this closing sequence, very haunting, Bosch-esque sequence, in which the soldiers are marching through this hellish landscape, singing the Mickey Mouse song, like little boys, like lost children. And Joker narrates this sequence, and he says, "I'm in a world of shit, but I'm alive, and I'm not afraid." And there's a lot of writing about how anticlimactic the ending of Full Metal Jacket is. And I think it's absolutely right. It is anticlimactic, but deliberately so. And I've got a few quotes about why this might be seen as deliberate. And I'll just let you read what I've presented here. So there we go. I think Kubrick very deliberately chopped off the head of the 3-act structure to create this feeling of lack of resolution, reflecting his subject matter, the lack of resolution of the war. So yeah, I was going to go on and talk about modular plots, which are very interesting to talk about, but I yammered too much, so I'll cut it short there, and I'll just present a final, my final slide. So my conclusion, basically, in the conclusion of my research and how to bring this into the classroom, is that I believe in teaching the convention and the alternatives side by side, or as side by side as practical, depending on the level of the students. Conventional monoplot, as I call it, is very useful, and it's fundamental. Screenwriters have to learn how to do this, but I try to teach it whilst encouraging students to criticize it and to look into how it emerged and why, and what it does to the viewer, to view it as supporting the dominant ideology, being very useful to the screenwriter and can create superlative cinema, but it also taps into, it supports the corporate ideology. It supported the blockbusterism of the film industry in the 80s and 90s. And it really ties into a corporate viewpoint, I think. It's inherently restorative. It suggests everything makes sense at the end. It has a kind of Judeo-Christian deterministic quality to it. I think it convincingly can be understood as fringing the non-normative in its dominance, because it is so dominant, pushes the non-normative narrative structures to the cultural fringe. These films still get made, but they're seen by far fewer people than they used to be. And perhaps it's poorly suited to dissent, like the work on Platoon, which argues that the restorative structure underpinning Platoon undercuts its anti-war message. And it's an interesting contrast with Full Metal Jacket. So there you go. I've talked too long, so I will stop and